Hello everyone. Welcome to Story Hub channel. Discover real stories of wife betrayals, shocking twists and turns and their secrets. Hit the subscribe button and get to our story. It was another Saturday morning, and like always, I was getting ready for my usual father-daughter day with Emily. She had her mind set on picking up a new book, and of course, stopping by her favorite ice cream shop. Jessica had already left early for her shift at the hospital, so it was just me and Emily. These Saturdays were the highlight of my week, offering me a much-needed break from the long hours I spent working on the construction site and giving me the chance to really connect with my little girl. We spent the day wandering through stores, enjoying ice cream, and feeding the birds at the park. Emily's laughter echoed through the air, and for a while, it felt like all my worries just melted away. When we got back home, I noticed that Jessica hadn't returned yet. Normally, she'd be home by this time, but I figured maybe her shift ran late. I didn't think too much of it and decided to get started on dinner. It was about 9 p.m. when Jessica finally walked through the door. There was something different about her. She seemed almost radiant. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and immediately went over to Emily, pulling her into a tight hug. I asked her how her day went, and she told me it had been busy at the hospital, but something felt a bit off. She was more upbeat than usual, almost more vibrant. Over the next few days, I started noticing small changes in Jessica. She began paying more attention to how she looked, putting on makeup and dressing up even when she didn't have to work. She also seemed to be spending extra hours at the hospital, taking on additional shifts. I just assumed she was trying to contribute more financially, especially since Emily's needs were growing as she got older. One evening, Jessica suggested that we go out for dinner, just the two of us. It had been a long time since we'd had a proper date night, so I was more than happy to agree. We found a cozy little Italian spot in downtown Orlando, and spent the evening chatting about everything and nothing at all. For a brief moment, it felt like we were newlyweds again. But as weeks turned into months, those moments became fewer and farther between. Jessica often seemed worn out, and our conversations gradually shifted from being about us to being about the logistics of life. I missed the closeness we used to share, but I couldn't figure out how to bring it back. One Saturday, while Jessica was working, Emily and I decided to surprise her by cleaning up the house and making her favorite meal. We spent the whole day scrubbing, dusting, and whipping up a delicious lasagna. Emily was thrilled to show her mom what we'd done, and I couldn't wait to see Jessica's reaction. When Jessica walked in that evening, she looked worn out, but when she saw the clean house and caught the scent of lasagna, her face lit up. "Wow, this is incredible. Thank you both so much," she said, hugging Emily first and then me. For a fleeting moment, everything felt just right. But that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jessica and I sat down for a chat. She opened up about how tough things were getting at the hospital, how the stress was starting to weigh on her. I wished there was more I could do to support her. Jessica thanked me for understanding and promised she'd try to make more time for us as a family. I believed her, clinging to the hope that things would turn around. Not long after, Jessica received an offer to work at a hospital in Palm Beach for a few weeks. I wasn't keen on the idea from the start. The thought of her being away from home didn't sit well with me. Who would make my breakfast or greet me in the evening with a warm dinner? I was so used to our routine, but Jessica was determined. "It's just 2 weeks," she said, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement. She really wanted to go, and eventually, I gave in. 2 days later, Jessica packed her bags and headed to Palm Beach. The house felt a lot emptier without her. The mornings were quieter, and dinners just weren't the same without her there. Life in Orlando continued as usual. Every summer, the city hosted a street food festival, showcasing a variety of dishes and desserts. It was a major event, attracting families, singles, and a lot of young people. Emily always loved going, and I enjoyed catching up with familiar faces while sampling the different foods. But this particular summer, things took a turn. A group of troublemakers showed up at the festival. They were the type who enjoyed causing havoc, breaking things, stealing, and picking on anyone they perceived as weaker. The atmosphere shifted in no time. What should have been a fun event quickly descended into chaos. These thugs ate, drank, yelled, and insulted everyone around them. Then they started smashing everything in their path. At first, the locals tried to handle the situation themselves, attempting to calm the troublemakers down, but their efforts only seemed to make things worse. The thugs became even more aggressive and destructive. It wasn't until the wail of a police siren echoed through the streets that they finally decided to make a break for it. They hopped on their motorcycles and sped off, hollering wild cries as they vanished into the distance. That day, Emily and I had stayed home instead of going to the festival. I had slightly injured myself climbing down the ladder after fixing the roof of our house, so we spent the day at home, tending to my injury and unknowingly missing out on the chaos that erupted downtown. Jessica called that evening to check in on us. She sounded content, though a little tired from her new job. I didn't mention the festival or the troublemakers to her. There was no reason to worry her. Instead, we talked about her work, Emily's latest antics, and how much we missed her. Even though 2 weeks felt like forever, hearing Jessica's voice made it a bit more bearable. With summer in full swing and Emily on vacation from school, I decided to send her to stay with her grandparents for a while. Something about Jessica's tone during our phone calls had been gnawing at me. She seemed distant, distracted, yet overly cheerful. I felt an overwhelming need to see for myself what was really going on in Palm Beach. I rented a car to avoid drawing attention and drove to Palm Beach. I parked near the hospital where Jessica was working and waited, watching from a distance. It didn't take long before I saw her emerge from the hospital with a man I didn't recognize. They were laughing and chatting as they headed toward a nearby restaurant. This guy had a noticeable limp in his left leg. I followed them, parking in a lot across the street. From my spot, I could see them clearly through the restaurant's large windows. They were sitting at a cozy corner table, and as I watched, the man leaned over and hugged Jessica before kissing her. She didn't push him away. Instead, she leaned into the kiss. My blood started to boil. I got out of the car and marched toward the restaurant, my thoughts racing. As I reached the entrance, a waitress asked if I had a reservation. I didn't even acknowledge her and shoved my way inside. I stormed up to their table and slammed my fist down hard on it, making the plates and glasses rattle. Jessica looked up at me, her face drained of color, completely shocked. "This is done, you!" I yelled, my voice cutting through the noise of the busy restaurant. The guy tried to get up, but I grabbed his arm from behind and twisted it until he let out a yelp of pain. I was just about to throw a punch when the waitress stepped in, warning me that she'd call the police if I didn't let him go. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked again. "We're packed right now, so it's reservations only." I released the guy's arm and he slumped back into his seat. Turning to the waitress, I muttered a half-hearted apology. "In that case, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the restaurant," she said firmly. "Or what? You'll toss me out yourself?" I shot back, still seething with anger. I pointed toward a distant table and said, "Looks like they're calling for you over there." The waitress glanced over her shoulder and quickly hurried off, giving me a brief moment to focus on Jessica. The guy started getting up to leave, groaning as he did. I had a mind to chase him down, but I held myself back. This was between Jessica and me now. I sat down across from her, and the shock was still clear on her face. "What the hell, Jessica? Who is he?" She fumbled for words, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, it's not what it looks like." "Don't even bother," I cut her off. "I've seen more than enough." Jessica glanced around, her eyes darting nervously as the restaurant's chatter seemed to grow louder. I noticed a few people glancing our way, but I couldn't care less. This was my wife, my life, and it was unraveling right before my eyes. "Tom, please, let's go somewhere private and talk," she begged, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to keep the rage inside from boiling over. "Fine, let's go." We left the restaurant, with Jessica walking ahead of me. I could see the fear and confusion in her every step. We got into the car and drove in silence, heading back to her temporary apartment. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jessica stared out the window while I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. She even had to pay for the meal herself because that guy took off. Her temporary apartment was a plain one-room place. The kind you rent when you don't plan on sticking around for long. The walls were a dull, lifeless beige, and the furniture was basic. A bed, a small table with a couple of chairs, and a dresser. There was a tiny kitchenette in the corner and a small bathroom off to the side. The place felt impersonal, almost sterile. Jessica sat down on the bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I took the chair across from her, still fuming with anger. "Don't think your stories are going to change how I feel about you now, but go ahead and try," I said coldly. She sighed deeply. "Tom, the day I arrived in Palm Beach, a man was brought into the hospital. He had been attacked by a tiger shark. He was a surfer, and he was lucky the shark only grazed his leg, but when he came in, he was covered in blood. The scars will be with him forever." I listened, my jaw clenched tight. Jessica went on, telling me how she'd seen this guy come in, wounded and bloody. She felt sorry for him. Every day she took care of him as a nurse. But their relationship quickly grew into something more. She fell for him. A week later, he was discharged, and she ended up going to his place. They started meeting at that restaurant. Even though he was out of the hospital, he was still young and strong. He was only 32. His name was Johnny. He made her laugh, and he brought her flowers. I tried to push the image of them together out of my mind, but it was impossible. A bitter taste filled my mouth. Flowers. Just perfect. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I know I betrayed you, but it wasn't something I planned. It just happened. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Johnny made me feel special, like I mattered." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a fling. She had actually fallen for this guy. I leaned back in the chair, struggling to wrap my head around it all. "Jessica, are you seriously telling me you fell in love with some guy in just a week?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Tom. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. It just did." I looked at her, and though I could see the regret in her eyes, it didn't change how I felt about the whole situation. As I sat there, the weight of Jessica's words pressed down on me, and the silence between us became unbearable. Eventually I stood up, ready to leave. Jessica looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "And now what?" she asked, her voice trembling. With a cold tone, I replied, "In any case, I don't believe in love at first sight. I thought I proved my love to you through all the good times we shared. But since you did this, then go to hell." She started to say something, but I was already out the door. I got back in the car and drove away, my mind swirling with anger and betrayal. The drive back to Orlando felt endless, the road stretching out before me, dark and empty, mirroring the void inside me. As I navigated that dark, deserted road, I noticed a commotion on the side of the highway. Several cars had pulled over, and a group of people seemed frantic, gathered around something. I slowed down and pulled over to see what was happening. A young woman was lying on the ground, her face pale and her breathing shallow. A man was kneeling beside her, pressing a jacket against a wound on her side. "She's been stabbed," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to get her to a hospital." Without a second thought, I jumped back into my car and drove it closer. "Get her in," I said. The man and another bystander carefully lifted her into the back seat, and I sped off toward the nearest hospital, adrenaline surging through my veins. The woman moaned softly in the back seat, and I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. The man who had been helping her now sat in the passenger seat, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. "What happened?" I asked, momentarily distracted from my own problems. "She was attacked at a rest area. I don't know who did it. It was total chaos," he explained. "Thank you for stopping." We reached the hospital, and I rushed inside to get help. Nurses and doctors quickly took over, wheeling the woman away on a stretcher. The man thanked me over and over, tears in his eyes. I nodded and turned to leave, my thoughts once again drifting back to Jessica and the mess that was now my life. As I drove the last stretch back to Orlando, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Here I was, doing good deeds like I just did. But now I had to clean the blood out of the back seat. Why did this have to happen to me? I thought about Jessica and everything that had unraveled. Finally, I pulled into the driveway of our house. I got home around 1 a.m., completely drained, both physically and emotionally. I washed up quickly and went straight to bed, not even bothering to fully undress. More than anything, I needed sleep, hoping that maybe by morning, I'd have some clarity. When I woke up around 10 a.m., I instinctively reached for my phone. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., Jessica had called me 8 times. I hadn't heard a single ring, even though I always kept my phone right beside me. I brushed it off, figuring she had come up with some new excuse to try and convince me to stay with her. But I wasn't about to fall for it. In my mind, I was already gearing up to file for divorce. I got out of bed, determined to put the events of the previous night behind me. It was summer, and work at the construction site had slowed down to a crawl. We had just wrapped up our last project, and there weren't any new contracts on the horizon. With nothing tying me down, I decided to pay a surprise visit to Emily and her grandparents in Hinesville, Georgia. I figured it would lift both our spirits. That morning, I went to the grocery store and grabbed some bread and sausage. I made a few sandwiches for the road, packed them up, and filled a bottle with water. The drive to Hinesville wasn't too long, but I wanted to be prepared. It had been a while since I'd seen my parents, and I missed them. Jessica's parents had passed away in a car accident 4 years ago, a tragedy that had really shaken her. But now, after everything that had happened, I couldn't muster any sympathy for her. I locked up the house, tossed my bag into the back seat of the car, and took one last look around before getting in. The trip to Hinesville went smoothly. The miles seemed to fly by as I drove through the sunny countryside, the radio playing in the background, and I did my best to push thoughts of Jessica out of my mind. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, the familiar sight of their cozy home brought a wave of comfort over me. Emily was the first to spot me. She came running out of the house, her face lighting up with surprise and joy. "Dad!" she shouted, throwing her arms around me. I hugged her tightly, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. My parents followed her out, looking just as surprised but thrilled to see me. "Tom, what a wonderful surprise," my mom exclaimed, pulling me into a hug. My dad clapped me on the back, grinning from ear to ear. We spent the day together, enjoying each other's company. Emily showed me the drawings she had been working on, each one more imaginative than the last. She had clearly inherited her grandmother's artistic talent, and it was obvious she loved every minute of it. We played board games, laughed at old family stories, and even managed to squeeze in a trip to the local park, where Emily and I tossed a frisbee around. At dinner, my mom cooked up a feast, her way of celebrating my unexpected visit. We sat around the table, eating and chatting, the conversation flowing easily. I hadn't mentioned anything about Jessica yet. I wasn't ready to bring that dark cloud into this happy moment. They didn't pry too much, perhaps sensing that I needed this time to unwind and recharge. After dinner, we sat out on the porch, watching the sunset. Emily was engrossed in a book, while my parents and I sipped coffee and talked. It felt good to be home, to be surrounded by people who loved and supported me unconditionally. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. It was strange, though, that Jessica hadn't called again. She was supposed to stay at the hospital in Palm Beach for a couple more days. I figured she had either forgotten about me or was too embarrassed and ashamed to call. Either way, I wasn't going to be the one to reach out first. Let her wrestle with her guilt on her own. The next morning, we decided to take a trip to the beach. Emily was over the moon, eagerly packing her bag with a swimsuit, towel, and sunscreen. We spent the day building sandcastles, splashing in the waves, and collecting seashells. My parents watched us from their beach chairs, smiling and snapping pictures. As I watched Emily run along the shoreline, her laughter blending with the sound of the ocean, I felt a moment of clarity wash over me. By the time we got back to the house, we were all pleasantly worn out. We had dinner, and Emily fell asleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. I stayed up a bit longer, chatting with my parents about the old days, trying to soak in the warmth and love that filled their home. Before heading to bed, I checked my phone one last time. Still no calls from Jessica. I let out a sigh, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. But honestly, it didn't matter to me anymore. The following morning, I was sitting in the house, talking with my dad. My mom was in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of dishes clinking and the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Emily was playing on the porch, lost in her own little world. Suddenly, I heard an unfamiliar voice coming from outside. "Excuse me, does the McVeigh family live here?" Emily went quiet, remembering what she'd been taught about not talking to strangers. Without a second thought, I stood up and walked over to the porch. "Emily, go inside," I said firmly. She nodded and quickly headed indoors. The man standing at the edge of the porch looked vaguely familiar. As he saw me, he asked, "Tom McVeigh?" "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" At first, his voice and face didn't click, but then I realized I'd seen someone like him before. He seemed uneasy, almost hesitant. "I'm David Hartman," he introduced himself. "I'm Johnny's brother." My heart skipped a beat. Johnny, the guy Jessica had been seeing. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David looked around nervously. "Can we talk inside?" The mention of her name sent a chill through me. I nodded and led him into the house. We sat down in the living room, and I braced myself for whatever he was about to say. "Last night something happened," David began. "Johnny and Jessica were together when it did." "What happened?" I demanded. David took a deep breath. "Well, they were both attacked. Someone broke into Johnny's place. He tried to fight them off but got fatally injured. He was stabbed. Jessica called 911, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. He didn't make it." I felt a surge of shock and anger. "He's gone?" "What about Jessica?" I asked quietly. "She's in the hospital. She was hurt, but not as badly. She's been trying to reach you," I muttered. "Do the police have any idea who did it?" I asked, trying to make sense of everything. David shook his head. "Not yet. They're investigating. But there's no clear suspect. Johnny had some shady connections. People who might have had a reason to go after him." I stood up, needing to move, to think. My dad, who had been silently listening, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Son, is there anything I can do to help?" "I need to see Jessica," I said, the words coming out before I fully thought them through. "At least make sure she's okay." David nodded. "I can take you to the hospital. It's about a 6-hour drive from here." I turned to my dad. "Dad, you and Mom stay with Emily. I'll go on my own." "Sure. Take care of yourself," he said as he headed into the room where Emily was playing. I grabbed my keys and followed David to his car. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent, neither of us saying a word. When we arrived, David led me to Jessica's room. She was lying in bed, looking pale and frail. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and tears immediately began to spill over. "Tom," she whispered, her voice cracking. I stepped closer, taking in the sight of her, and decided to be straightforward. "To be honest, Jessica, while I was driving here, and when I first heard what happened, I felt a little sympathy for you. But now that I've seen you, that sympathy is gone." She started to cry, and I could see the fear and regret in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant for any of this to happen." I stood there, feeling nothing but a cold detachment. "You brought this on yourself, Jessica." She turned her head away, her sobs filling the room. I didn't move, didn't try to comfort her. I couldn't. David, still standing awkwardly by the door, cleared his throat. "I'll give you two some privacy." As he left, I sat down in the chair beside Jessica's bed, keeping my distance. "Why didn't you call again?" I asked, my voice flat. "I was ashamed," she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to say. I nodded, not surprised. "Well, it's too late for apologies. I came here to find out what happened, to get the truth, and to see that you can take care of yourself. But don't expect me to forgive you." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Tom, please, "Save it, Jessica," I cut her off. "You made your bed. Now you can lie in it." Just then, a doctor walked into the room. I turned to him, eager for answers. "How is she doing?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. The doctor gave me a reassuring nod. "She received several blows, but only one was serious. We've already taken care of it. She's going to be fine." Knowing that Jessica was out of danger, I felt a strange mix of relief and resignation. "Thank you for saving her life," I said to the doctor. Then, turning back to Jessica, I added, "Goodbye." Without waiting for her response, I walked out of the room. David was waiting for me outside, his face etched with concern. "How did it go?" he asked. "She's fine," I replied. "No need to worry." David nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "I'll be handling my brother's funeral arrangements now." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, offering him a brief handshake. We exchanged a few more words of support, and then we went our separate ways. The sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. It was around 6 p.m. I got into my car and started the long drive back to Orlando. My mind was made up. Tomorrow, I would file for divorce. Jessica was supposed to work at the clinic the next day, but I knew she wouldn't be going anywhere for a while. About halfway through the drive, my phone rang. It was Jessica. I answered, but didn't give her a chance to speak. "When you're well enough, come back to Orlando. I'll tell you what happens next." With that, I ended the call. I drove the rest of the way in silence, the road ahead clear. The next morning, I did what I had to do. I went to the courthouse and filed for divorce. The process was straightforward, the paperwork simply reflecting the decisions I had already made in my mind. Jessica found out about the divorce filing a couple of days later when she returned to Orlando. Her health had improved enough for her to leave the hospital, and she immediately came back to face the inevitable. To her relief, there was at least one piece of good news. The medical institution where she worked had decided to take her back. We divorced quietly, without any drama or scandal. There were no shouting matches, no drawn-out court battles. We both knew it was over, and dragging it out would only hurt Emily more. When the final papers were signed, we said our goodbyes for the last time. Jessica packed up her things and moved to the city where she would continue her work at the hospital. Surprisingly, the divorce process didn't take long. Maybe it was because we both wanted to move on and put the past behind us as quickly as possible. Emily returned home toward the end of the summer, just as everything was being finalized. She wasn't an adult, but she understood what was going on. She knew who was at fault and who wasn't, and she handled it all with a maturity that made me proud. Emily and I settled into our new routine. She became my top priority, and I made sure she knew that. We spent more time together, focusing on creating a stable and happy home for just the two of us. I wanted to make sure she felt secure, loved, and supported through all the changes. One unexpected silver lining in all of this was the friendship that developed between David and me. After Johnny's death and the aftermath of the attack, David and I found common ground. We both had lost something significant, and that shared experience created a bond between us. We started meeting up regularly, talking about everything from the ordinary to the deeply personal. David became a good friend, someone I could rely on. Our daughters even got along well, which only strengthened our friendship. Jessica moved to her new city and threw herself into her work. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was doing well in her career. We didn't stay in touch except when it came to matters concerning Emily. My daughter adjusted to the new normal remarkably well. She excelled at school, made new friends, and continued to grow into an incredible young woman. We talked openly about the divorce, and I made sure she knew it was okay to have mixed feelings about it. Some weekends, she would visit Jessica, and other times she stayed with me. As the years went by, the pain of the past started to fade. Just last week, we celebrated Emily's 17th birthday. It was a small, joyful gathering with close friends and family. She's grown into a beautiful young woman, and I'm incredibly proud of her. Seeing her surrounded by people who love and support her, I realized how far we've come since those dark days. During the celebration, I found out that Jessica has a boyfriend. They've been dating for several months. It's strange to think of her moving on, but it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I guess I've made my peace with the past. As for me, I haven't had anyone in my life since the divorce. I'm not sure if I ever will. I don't know if there's love after 40. What do you think?